Machiavelli never wrote a single page about gym routines or morning alarms because he understood something almost no one alive today understands. Discipline isn't a habit, it's a war, and most men have already lost it before they wake up. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt like your own mind was working against you, this video is going to feel uncomfortably personal. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because what comes next will change how you see control forever. There is a question that almost no one asks, because almost no one survives long enough inside their own head to ask it. The question is this: who is actually in charge of you? Not your job, not your government, not your circumstances. You. Right now, in this moment, as you listen to this, who decided that? Was it a calculated choice, born from strategy and intention? Or was it an impulse, a craving for stimulation, a mind wandering because it has never been trained to stay still? Niccolo Machiavelli spent his life studying power, not the power of armies or thrones, but the power that determines who rises and who collapses under pressure. And buried inside his writings is a darker, more personal truth. The man who cannot rule himself will never truly rule anything else. Every external conquest is a mirror of an internal one. The empire is built on the architecture of the mind that conceived it. Here is the contradiction that defines almost everyone's life. We live in an age obsessed with self-improvement, yet surrounded by people more anxious, more distracted, and more controlled by their impulses, perhaps any generation in history. We have more access to discipline than ever, and yet discipline itself has become rarer. Why? Because most people are fighting the wrong war. They think the enemy is laziness, procrastination, lack of motivation. But the enemy is not a behavior. The enemy is an unexamined mind, one that has never been confronted, mapped, or commanded. Think about how a general approaches a battlefield. Before a single soldier moves, the general studies the terrain. They identify strengths, weaknesses, blind spots, points of vulnerability. They do not simply hope the battle goes well. They calculate. Now ask yourself, have you ever done that with your own mind? Most people haven't. Most people live reactively, bouncing from impulse to impulse, mistaking movement for progress and noise for purpose. This is the first hidden truth. Focus is not a feeling you wait for. It is a decision you make. The same way a general decides where troops will be positioned, regardless of mood, regardless of comfort. The moment you wait to feel disciplined is the moment discipline has already lost. Historically, the men who shaped civilizations were not the ones with the most talent or the most resources. They were the ones who had already won the war inside themselves before stepping onto the field. Caesar crossing the Rubicon wasn't a moment of impulse. It was the final external expression of a decision made internally, long before, when ambiguity was eliminated and commitment became total. This is where most people get it backwards. They wait for external success to build internal confidence. But the conqueror's mindset works in reverse. Internal command creates the conditions for external results. The mind is conquered first. Everything else follows. And here is where it gets unsettling. Because if internal mastery comes first, then every external failure in your life is, in some way, a reflection of an internal battle you haven't yet won. Not as blame, as information, as intelligence about where the real war is happening. So the great question is not, how do I become more productive? That's a surface-level question, addressing symptoms rather than causes. The real question is this: have you ever actually taken command of your own mind? Or has it simply been running on autopilot, reacting to whatever crosses its path? Boldness without command is just noise. And command begins with a confrontation most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The confrontation with their own undisciplined mind. If this is starting to feel uncomfortably accurate, that's not an accident, and it only gets more revealing from here. If you haven't already, subscribe now so you don't lose this, and like the video if you're starting to see yourself in this, because the next part exposes a pattern that's been quietly running your life without your permission. Here's something almost no one notices about their own behavior. The moment something goes wrong, the body reacts before the mind even has a chance to think. A comment lands, a setback hits, a rejection, and within milliseconds, something fires. Heart rate increases, tension builds, words form, ready to defend, explain, or retaliate. This is the pattern, and it is so universal that most people never recognize it as a pattern at all. They simply call it being human. But there's another word for it: predictability. And predictability in any form of strategy is the single greatest vulnerability a person can have. If someone can predict exactly how you'll react to criticism, exactly what will make you defensive, exactly what buttons to press, they don't need power over you. Your own reactions become the lever they pull. You become a weapon used against yourself. This is the second hidden truth. Emotional reactions are not signs of strength or authenticity. They are exposure. Every time someone reacts instantly and visibly to provocation, they reveal the map of their psychology to anyone paying attention. Now contrast this with the strategic mind. Not cold, not emotionless, but calibrated. When provocation arrives, the strategic mind does something almost unnatural in our reactive culture. It pauses. It observes. It asks, what is actually happening here? What does this person want from my reaction? What does responding right now cost me? And what does it cost me to wait? This is not weakness. This is the deliberate withholding of information. Across centuries of political and military history, the same pattern repeats. Those who reveal their hand first lose leverage. Leaders who react emotionally to criticism reveal exactly where their insecurities lie, and insecurities, once revealed, become tools others learn to use. There's an unexpected connection here that most people never make. The discipline required to pause before reacting is the exact same discipline required to build long-term wealth, long-term relationships, and long-term influence. It's all the same muscle. The person who can sit with an uncomfortable urge to respond is the same person who can sit with an uncomfortable urge to spend, to quit, to seek validation, to chase shortcuts. Self-control isn't compartmentalized. It's a single system. And most people are training the wrong version of it every single day, training themselves to react faster, respond louder, engage more impulsively, because that's what gets rewarded in environments built on instant feedback. Here's the darker pattern, the one operating beneath the surface of daily life. Most people are not actually pursuing their own goals. They are reacting to an endless stream of external stimuli, notifications, opinions, comparisons, provocations, and calling that reaction living. The mind that has never been trained to calculate becomes a mind that is constantly being calculated against.
Here's the psychological truth that ties this together. The less someone reacts emotionally, the more space they create to actually think strategically. Reaction and strategy cannot coexist in the same moment. One always displaces the other. Every second spent reacting is a second not spent calculating. And in any competitive environment, the side doing more calculating and less reacting almost always wins over time.
So here is the pattern most people miss. They think their reactions are simply who they are, an unchangeable trait. But reactions are not identity. They are conditioning. And conditioning can be retrained, the same way a soldier learns to remain calm under fire. Not because they feel nothing, but because they've decided in advance what their response will be regardless of what happens. This is the shift from a reactive mind to a calculating one. And once you see this pattern, you start to see it everywhere. In arguments you didn't need to have, in purchases you didn't need to make, in explanations you didn't need to give.
The mechanism is this. Your environment is constantly making decisions for you, long before you consciously decide anything. The people you spend time with, the spaces you occupy, the inputs you consume, these create a baseline, a default setting. And here's the unsettling part. Most people never chose their baseline. It was assigned to them, slowly, through years of unconscious exposure. This is the third hidden truth, and it contradicts almost everything modern culture tells us about loyalty. Proximity is programming. The people closest to you are not just influencing your mood, they are calibrating your standards, your ambitions, your tolerance for discomfort, and your definition of normal. Throughout history, those who rose to power did not simply work harder than everyone around them. They restructured who and what surrounded them. They eliminated relationships that drained resources, not out of cruelty, but out of strategic necessity. Yet most people maintain connections that are quietly feeding their weaknesses, simply because cutting them feels uncomfortable. This is where silence becomes mechanically important, not just philosophically important. Every time you explain your plans, your goals, your strategy to people who haven't earned the right to that information, you open a channel for doubt, a channel for opinions never asked for, a channel for energy to leak out of a project before it's even built. Think about how often ambition dies, not from failure, but from exposure. An idea gets shared too early, gets met with lukewarm reactions, and the internal fire that was driving it flickers. Not because the idea was bad, but because it was exposed to an environment that wasn't ready to hold it yet. Silence isn't about secrecy for its own sake. It's about protecting the early, fragile stages of any goal from an environment that hasn't yet been restructured to support it. Building in the dark isn't mysticism. It's environmental engineering. You're controlling the variables before the variables can control you. Now, here's where the mechanism becomes almost mathematical. Desire, raw, unfiltered desire, is energy. It's fuel. But fuel without direction doesn't create movement. It creates explosions. Unchecked appetite, whether for food, validation, pleasure, or status, consumes energy without producing forward motion. The same intensity that could be channeled into building something is instead burned on impulses that leave nothing behind.
This is why so many people feel simultaneously driven and stuck. They have the fuel. What they're missing is the containment system, the structure that directs that energy toward a single point rather than letting it scatter in 100 directions. Ambition without discipline isn't dangerous to others. It's dangerous to the person who has it. It burns them out before it builds anything. Here's where it gets even more counterintuitive. The mechanism that builds true unbreakability isn't avoiding difficulty. It's voluntarily creating controlled difficulty during periods of calm. Most people only encounter resistance when life forces it on them. A crisis, a loss, a failure. And in those moments, they discover, often too late, that they have no internal reference point for how to handle pressure. But those who deliberately expose themselves to manageable discomfort during stable periods are quietly building something most people don't know exists, a relationship with their own will. Not confidence in the sense of feeling good, but evidence gathered through repeated experience that when things get hard, they do not abandon themselves. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not here by accident, so make sure you're subscribed, because this next section is where everything starts connecting, and you won't want to miss the rest of this breakdown.
So restrict exposure to draining environments. Restrict unnecessary disclosure of plans. Restrict unchecked impulse. And intentionally introduce controlled difficulty. What emerges isn't a harsher version of a person. It's a more concentrated one. Less energy leaking out through reactions, explanations, distractions, and unchecked appetite. More energy available for a single, calculated direction.
And this is precisely where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves. Not through one dramatic failure, but through 1,000 small leaks they were never taught to notice. Theory is comfortable. Consequences are not. So let's look at what actually happens when these mechanisms are ignored, and what happens when they're applied. Consider two people with nearly identical talent, starting from nearly identical circumstances. One operates reactively, explaining every plan before it's ready, surrounding themselves with people who unconsciously resent ambition, seeking comfort the moment discomfort appears, and responding instantly to every provocation. The other protects early-stage ideas through silence, restructures their environment around their goals rather than their comfort, treats desire as fuel to be directed rather than indulged, and uses calm periods to build resilience rather than waiting for crisis to reveal it. 5 years later, these two people are not in the same place. And here's the contradiction most people refuse to accept. The difference between them was rarely about a single big decision. It was about thousands of small moments. Moments most people don't even register as decisions at all. This pattern shows up again and again in the rise and fall of leaders, dynasties, and movements. Those who maintained power over long periods rarely did so through one dramatic strategy. They did so through consistent, almost invisible discipline, controlling information, managing alliances with precision, refusing to let momentary emotion dictate long-term positioning. Those who fell from power often did so not because of one catastrophic mistake, but because of an accumulation of small reactive decisions, revealing too much, trusting too easily, reacting too quickly to perceived threats. This is the psychological truth hiding inside almost every downfall. Collapse rarely happens all at once. It happens gradually, through a slow erosion of internal command, until external pressure simply exposes what was already hollow. Now, here's where this becomes deeply personal. Your circle, the people you spend the most time with, functions as a kind of invisible ceiling. Not because those people are bad, but because human beings are wired to seek belonging, and belonging requires similarity. If your ambitions begin to exceed the unspoken norms of your circle, you start to feel friction. Not from enemies, from people who care about you.
This friction often disguises itself as concern. Are you sure you want to take that risk? Don't you think you're being a bit much? These questions can come from genuine love and still function as an invisible ceiling because they're calibrated to a version of normal that no longer matches where you're trying to go. This is why so many people who achieve significant growth describe a period of quiet distancing from old relationships, not out of arrogance, but because the architecture of their mind has changed, and environments calibrated to the old architecture create constant, low-level friction with the new one. When you disappear from view to focus on growth, you're not just protecting your plans from premature judgment. You're giving your environment time to either rise to meet your new trajectory or naturally fall away. Either outcome clarifies your circle far more honestly than any conversation could. Now consider the long game, perhaps the most consequential principle of all, because it operates on a timescale most people are psychologically unequipped to handle. We live in an environment engineered for instant feedback. Every action produces an immediate response, a notification, a reaction, a result. This trains the nervous system to expect rapid confirmation that effort is working. But the most consequential outcomes in history, empires, fortunes, transformations of character, were never built on this timescale. They were built by people who could plant something with no visible return for months or years and continue tending to it anyway because their sense of progress was internally generated rather than externally confirmed. This is the real consequence of impatience. Most people abandon strategies not because the strategies were wrong, but because the strategies didn't provide feedback on the timescale their nervous system was trained to expect. They confuse not yet visible with not working and abandon exactly the efforts that needed more time, while continuing efforts that provide quick feedback but lead nowhere significant. So here is the consequence, stated plainly. Calculation over reaction, silence over disclosure, controlled desire over impulse, controlled difficulty over avoidance, environment over willpower, patience over speed. All of it compounds, not linearly, but exponentially. Small advantages, repeated consistently over time, create gaps between people that eventually look like talent, or luck, or privilege, but are in reality the accumulated result of internal architecture applied consistently, while others operated reactively. This is why the gap between people who seem naturally disciplined and those who struggle endlessly is rarely about willpower in the moment. It's about which system has been running silently in the background for years. And here is what almost no one realizes until it's too late. Everything we've discussed, calculation, silence, controlled desire, controlled difficulty, environmental restructuring, patience, is not actually about becoming a better version of yourself in the way self-help culture typically frames it. It's about removing the parts of yourself that were never actually you in the first place. Think about this carefully. The instant reactions, the compulsive need to explain yourself, the impulses that scatter your energy, the relationships that quietly cap your ambitions, the impatience that makes you abandon long-term efforts. Where did these come from? Were they chosen deliberately by you? Or were they absorbed from environments, from people, from a culture engineered to keep attention fragmented and impulses unchecked? This is the final hidden truth, and it reframes everything.
The undisciplined version of you is not your true self being suppressed by discipline. It's the conditioned self, built by years of unconscious exposure to environments that rewarded reaction, distraction, and impulse. Discipline doesn't suppress who you are. It removes who you were trained to be, revealing something that was underneath all along. Conquering your inner war isn't about becoming harsher or more rigid. It's about becoming more concentrated. Less energy leaking into reactions that don't matter, explanations that don't serve you, relationships that quietly limit you, and impulses that scatter your direction. What remains, when all of that leakage stops, is something that behaves very differently in the world. Not because it's trying harder, but because it's no longer divided against itself. This is the person who becomes the weapon, not in the sense of aggression or domination over others, but in the sense of singular, undivided force. A person who is no longer fighting themselves has an almost unfair advantage over those who are still locked in that internal war, even if that war is invisible to everyone, including the person experiencing it. And here's the contradiction that closes the loop. The people who most need this internal conquest are often the ones least likely to pursue it, because the conditioned self is remarkably good at convincing you that reaction is authenticity, that explanation is honesty, that impulse is freedom, and that impatience is passion. The conditioned self defends itself by disguising its weaknesses as virtues. This is why so few people ever actually undertake this internal conquest, not because it's impossible, but because the very mind that needs to be conquered is the one deciding whether the war is even necessary. It's like asking an occupying force to vote on whether the occupation should continue. But for those who do see it, who recognize the pattern, who feel the friction between who they've been conditioned to be and who they could become if that conditioning were removed, there is no going back to not seeing it. Once you notice how much of your daily experience is reaction rather than choice, you cannot unnotice it. The question we started with, who is actually in charge of you, stops being theoretical. It becomes personal, immediate, unavoidable.
This isn't a system you implement once and complete. It's a war that's already happening, every day, whether you engage in it consciously or not. The only choice is whether you fight it deliberately, with calculation, silence, direction, and patience, or whether you continue losing it passively, one unnoticed reaction at a time, while calling that loss just being yourself. The conqueror's mindset isn't about becoming someone new. It's about finally meeting who was there all along, underneath everything that was never actually yours to begin with. True conquest has never been about controlling others. It has always been about removing the internal noise that was never truly yours, until what remains is a single, undivided force aimed at one direction. If this video gave you even one moment of clarity about your own mind, that clarity is worth holding on to. Subscribe so you don't lose this channel. Like the video so it reaches the people who need to see it. And share it with someone who's fighting a war they don't even know they're in.